And we're back, and we are just getting our final conversation for this morning started. And we are, of course, bringing you, we're continuing with our segment on wildlife in Belize that has been brought to you by Red Plus with funding from the World Bank. And this morning we are going to be speaking about deforestation and how that affects wildlife in Belize. And so joining us, we have Chanelle Carrillo-Balan, who is from the Belize Forest Department. We also have Nikki Buxton, who is with Belize Birds Rescue, as well as Paul Walker from Wild Tracks. Good morning.
Good morning.
All right. And thank you for joining us, everyone. This is, of course, a very important topic, and it's a very big issue that is facing us in Belize. So perhaps we can start then with Chanelle and talk a little bit about deforestation, what we've been observing in Belize recently, and then we can get into some of the impacts that we are looking that are caused by deforestation.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So yes, we can start with deforestation and just the impact it has had on wildlife species, wildlife populations. A lot of wildlife have been displaced from different areas of Belize. We can no longer find these species in certain areas. So we're seeing that we need to do something about it if we want to make sure that these animals are here in the future. And that's where we come into forest restoration. And what is forest restoration? So this week we have discussed in the previous segments about we need to start planting trees again sometimes. But when we talk about restoration, it's improving the health, the productivity, and the species that are supposed to be in the forest. So it's not only about the plants, but also about the animals. Plants and animals are linked and they influence each other. So we need to make sure that in restoration activities, we have to involve the wildlife species as well. So when we talk about restoration, we need to plant trees, we need to improve the soils, but also restore wildlife populations. So when we start planting these trees in these areas that we want to restore, we need to make sure that we plant native trees that can provide food sources for these animals, but also nesting, perching, and roosting sites. And when you reintroduce these wildlife populations, they will help with the restoration process even further, because from studies we have seen that 90% of tropical trees and shrubs depend on animals for seed dispersal. Yeah. So these animals are so important when we want to restore forest areas. And also we need to think about wildlife corridors. So we need to maintain certain areas so wildlife can move if we want to continue having these populations in a healthy state. So it's all very interesting how plants and animals are linked, influencing each other. So when we talk about restoration here at the Forest Department, we're also thinking, how do we involve the wildlife? How do we make sure that the trees are there, but also the wildlife populations that we so depend on are also there into the future?
And from what you have observed and or probably researched at the Forest Department, what are the major or the main causes of deforestation in Belize?
There can be several causes. There can be natural, but also human activity can be a part of why we have deforestation. So in certain areas, when we're speaking about wildlife, we can look, for example, at the issues with hurricanes. When hurricanes pass through, they can affect certain areas of forest and displace certain animals. So, for example, I believe that Paul from Wild Tracks will be going more into detail about this. Yeah. But hurricanes can really affect forested areas and displace these animals. So now it's us as the entities working with wildlife. We need to make sure, how do we make sure that wildlife can return? Is it safe for them to return? So it's not only human activity, but also just natural disasters. We have to take into account both sides.
Interesting. Yeah, Paul, so Chanelle gave you an intro there. I think we often think of human impact, and while we know that does have a level of displacement with wildlife, there are other factors as well that may lead to their displacement. Tell us about that.
Yeah, indeed. And the human land clearance certainly is a national challenge. Yeah. But the hurricane impacts are becoming an increasingly big concern, primarily because of the increasing frequency, increasing strength associated with climate change. Again, it's human directed. Years back when hurricanes were infrequent, and the populations of animals such as the monkeys were pretty much across the country, a hurricane would come through, like Hurricane Iris back in southern Belize, and have a huge impact on the local populations of monkeys. Many monkeys would be killed and displaced by that storm. But there'd be populations close by that could move back in over the coming years as the forest started to regenerate. Now, with increasing frequency, there's a greater risk of more and more populations of monkeys and other wildlife being wiped out by the hurricanes or significantly hit by the hurricanes, and reducing their chance to recuperate. So it's increasingly important that we retain as much forest cover across the full length of the country as possible to try and mitigate some of the risks from hurricanes. And it's not so much the hurricane itself that's the big problem, it's post-hurricane fires. We've seen it time and again that forests will bounce back from hurricane impacts pretty fast, 3, 4, 5, 6 years, and much of the forest is generated. But if a fire goes through, then we're looking at a much longer recuperation period.
That's interesting. And it also, there's a link in when you look at hurricanes and when it does destroy the forest, how it makes it more prone for fires after. So when we look at the floods we had last year, this year we do have to be extremely careful.
That's undoubtedly the case, yeah. And it's not, and talking of floods, I was down in Coxcomb back in 2008 when Tropical Storm Arthur came through, and the illegal logging upriver from the Kendall Bridge was what resulted in the loss of the Kendall Bridge. The massive trees have been cut right down the riparian forest area, the same trees that came down in the floodwaters and hit the bridge and took the whole bridge out. So it's all manner of impacts associated with some of these tropical storm events.
Before we go any further, Paul, it's a great opportunity for us to hear a bit more about what you do there at Wild Tracks, because we're very distracted by those cute little monkeys that are showing along with your interview. But you do critical work, as we'll find out from bird rescue as well, in rehabilitating and sometimes reintroducing wildlife back into the forest. Tell us about that.
Indeed. Well, we work in partnership with the Forest Department. Been working with monkeys now for just over 10 years. So Forest Department has a policy, a zero tolerance policy for illegal pet monkeys. So any monkey that has been caught from the wild and is being kept in Belize will be confiscated if it's not surrendered. They're transferred to Wild Tracks, where we rehabilitate them, get them back into good health, introduce them into small troops, let them learn the skills they need for life in the wild, and then release them back into the wild as functioning groups. So to date, we've released 75 howler monkeys, which is an endangered species, back into the wild. 95% of those have survived really well, which is more than double the kind of regional level of success. And that population is breeding fast. So the monkeys that we've released are having babies, their babies are now having babies, and the population is functioning well. And with that is now the population is now fulfilling the function of seed dispersal from all the fruits they're eating. And we are seeing significant changes in the density of the tree species that they eat and spread the fruits from. So it can work. It's a lot of work, but it can be very, very productive. And we're actually this year just starting a second release. But most of our releases so far have been up in the Northeast Biological Corridor. Janelle mentioned corridors, the important corridors. So we've been reintroducing howlers into that area for the last 10 years. They were wiped out from this area back by the 1940s. It already disappeared from there, largely from hunting pressure. With those pressures gone, we're able to reintroduce the population back into the area, which is a great mitigation against future hurricane impact. Now this year, literally we're just starting the first release in a second site, another protected area. And actually that group of monkeys are scheduled to be released from the release enclosure this morning. So it's an auspicious day.
Oh, that's fun. And let's talk to Belize about Belize Bird Rescue. Similar theme there in rehabilitation as well.
Yes, indeed. We a lot of our work is focused on parrots and on the yellow-headed parrot in particular, which is also an endangered species. And this one breeds in the pine savanna. It's quite unique in that it crosses the broadleaf forests for foraging and then breeds in the pine savanna, in the pine trees there. which makes the preservation of that habitat very, very important for that species, and actually vice versa, as Paul and Shelley have both pointed out. There's a symbiosis there, and without the parrots, the seed dispersal wouldn't happen within the pine savanna. Yeah. So we actually work closely with the tide rangers in the south of Belize, who work an awful lot with fire prevention, creating buffer zones and doing controlled burns, and they are incredible with the work that they've done there. And we're starting to see regeneration of the forests due to that work. Yeah. They also put up artificial nest boxes because due to illegal logging and habitat destruction through man-set fires as well as natural fires, yeah. The cavities that these birds breed in are becoming fewer and fewer available. So as we increase the populations through the work that we're doing at Belize Bird Rescue, we'll obviously need more nesting sites for these guys to breed in. Yeah. So what we actually do, the rangers will monitor the birds throughout the breeding season, and within the cavity they'll lay like 4 eggs. The parents will lay 4 eggs, and probably only 2 of those eggs will four eggs will hatch, but there'll only actually be room in the cavity for 2 of them to fledge. And as the chicks grow, there's less and less space, and the older chicks will kind of squash the smaller ones. So the rangers will pull those 2 little ones and bring them to Belize Bird Rescue, where we will hand raise them and keep them safe throughout the rest of the year, and then take them back during the next breeding season for release. Yeah. And so far we've put back 158 of those birds into a population of fewer than 1,600. Wow. So, and again, as Paul said, our birds are now breeding, and it is actually increasing the population. So it's a positive impact on what the rangers are doing in the forest areas as well.
That's fascinating. So while both organizations are working to try to maintain and grow the populations, you still do face threats. And I was thinking of last year with the Australian fires and how we all felt so affected when we thought of koalas and all these other animals who were impacted by those fires. But we do have the similar situation here with our wildlife.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And it's heartbreaking for the people that protect these areas, that work within the protected areas. It's absolutely heartbreaking for them to see these like tiny charred bodies all over the place. And it has an impact right across the system. So you have animals that can escape these fires, the fast moving birds and prey species and predator species, but now their prey has gone and their habitat's gone and their food sources have gone. So it affects absolutely everybody. And when massive areas are burned, it concentrates wildlife into smaller and smaller areas. And it's a totally disrupted ecosystem, which is unsustainable in the long term. So 1 or 2 fires, I think Belize can handle. But when it's every single year in the same areas, and these areas are growing annually, and especially with the added impact of the agriculture deforestation, we're seeing higher and higher concentrations of a distorted ecosystem, which is not sustainable for the country.
And,
yeah, indeed. We see similar issues with the monkeys. What we can do is really apply a Band-Aid. So some monkeys will be displaced, and we're able to capture those, treat them for whatever infections and injuries they may have, and then release them back into the wild. But the bigger issues really are the populations which are being annihilated. The fires in Vaca Forest Reserve recently were recorded as killing an awful lot of wildlife to death, and people could actually hear the sounds of animals dying in the flames, which is a really tragic situation, one which shouldn't have happened. If farmers will follow the policies properly in terms of fire, controlling the fires and having fire breaks, wildfires really should be a rare occurrence rather than a common occurrence they are.
Yeah. Let me understand a bit, just because when I think Nikki mentioned it just now, that there are some animals who are able to escape a fire, which we can naturally think of. And I would assume that would include 2 of the main populations that you are speaking of. A monkey can swing its way out fast enough. Tell me if I'm wrong. And of course, the birds have the capacity to fly. But is the question kind of just responding to the emergency threat that comes about? It's not a part of their adaptation?
It's actually more important to try and tackle the issue in advance through public awareness, through training to try and prevent these fires, because the fires are so incredibly damaging. Some monkeys may escape, others will not. There are plenty of records of troops of monkeys being killed by fire. The ones that can escape are potentially the lucky ones, but it's far more effective to control fires before they start than try and fight them. The Forest Department can vouch the effort needed to put out a large-scale forest fire is huge. It's a massive task and it's a dangerous task. It's far better to try and prevent those through proper fire management, public awareness, letting people know they need to be very careful during the dry season about any fires, any fire risks. Even a cigarette can cause a fire in the dry season. But it's a societal need to recognize that fire is bad for the country, bad for the economy, and bad for the wildlife. And therefore, a societal need to respond to that and be careful.
Yeah.
And are we also, or perhaps you can say to what extent we are seeing the impact when it comes to wildlife of issues related to climate change? Because, Marlene had earlier brought up last year's floods. But we are also seeing things like more active than normal hurricane seasons of the past few years, and temperatures and weather systems have been seemingly getting a lot more intense than what we're used to. So perhaps you can shed a little light on what that looks like, or the impact of that looks like to some of our wildlife.
Sure. So if I can answer, so just in addition to what Paul has mentioned, we have seen with natural disasters, we have the increase in fires, increase in hurricanes, the strength of hurricanes, but it's something where, for example, fires. Animals can try to escape a fire, but not all of them will. But the ones that escape don't really have a forest to go back to if it was completely burnt. So there is where we see that fire can be good if used properly, but just lighting a forest fire and not controlling it really damages an ecosystem. It displaces these animals. And with the increase in hurricanes we're seeing as well, it's just displacing these animals. So the Forest Department works with several organizations throughout the country for wildlife rehabilitation, just as what Paul and Ms. Nikki work with. We try to see how can we work with these animals that are displaced, animals that are injured, to try and find them areas where they can probably exist again, or areas where they have lesser threats. But of course, with climate change and just temperatures increasing, more natural disasters, it's just making it harder to find areas where wildlife can safely exist. And so we have seen it not just in Belize, but worldwide, just increase in temperatures. It's affecting the plants that grow in certain areas. So we're going to be seeing shifts in what type of plants grow here and there. And then this is going to be affecting our wildlife, which depend on these plants for the shelter, for the food sources, for everything.
Yeah. This is,
so the plants are so requirement of the wildlife for adapting to climate change as well. Belize's tree diversity will shift as the country dries and warms up. We'll have more Yucatan species becoming more prominent throughout certainly the northern forest. They'll need to be able to move through seed dispersal with the help of parrots and monkeys and other species along the corridor routes to repopulate areas where other species of tree are being dried out. So to maintain a functional ecosystem, we need as many of the components there as possible to retain functionality in the long term.
Yeah. And Nikki?
Also, Paul mentioned something very important, which is just drying up of certain areas. We have seen that, for example, in the Yucatan, where organizations that work with wildlife, they're seeing large areas just completely drying up, which means that there's no water source for wildlife. And they have started moving into these villages trying to find water, which makes them come more in contact with humans, and possibly poaching can happen. So that's where a threat is also increasing when it comes to climate change. It's really displacing these animals. And now as Belize, we have already started to think, what will happen if we reach to that point where water resources are going to be scarce? What will happen to the animals, and what can we implement to try and reduce those threats.
That is interesting, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was going to go beyond forest fires to talk about how the removal of whether it's the riparian forest, whether it's deforestation due to development or agriculture, very often can lead to displacement, which oftentimes we've seen in other populations leads to human-wildlife conflict or having them come into human spaces. What are the threats there? And I want to get Nikki in on this, because I know this has been a continuous struggle in getting people to recognize that there are certain species of birds that we just should not have at home.
Exactly, yes. Yeah, thank you for giving me the opportunity to say that. Yeah, we are great advocates for not putting wild parrots in cages. They're really not adapted for that, and they're living within their natural environment inside a cage. And it doesn't matter how much you spend time with the bird and feel like it's part of the family, et cetera, there's always that underlying desire to go off, to breed, to be with its wild compatriots, to fly. I mean, that's what they're designed to do. So stopping them breeding, stopping them flying, it's pretty much everything that they live for. And it doesn't make for a happy relationship. Plus, of course, it's devastating to the wild populations. We all know the yellowhead talks amazingly well, and that's why people want them in their homes. They're also, in our experience working with all the species of parrots that we have here in Belize, they are the most crazy, dare I say. They're jealous and they're aggressive and they bond to one person and can actually...
Oh, they're very possessive.
Oh my gosh, they certainly are. They're racist, they're sexist, they're everything. They are our most difficult species to rehabilitate for release.
Oh my God! If they've been raised in captivity.
Correct. Yeah. If particularly, if they bonded to one particular person or one particular sex or a look of a person, you tend to find that they are anti anything that looks like the opposite, or maybe they've had an abusive relationship with somebody, and of course that puts an aggressive tendency towards anything that looks like that too. So it's very interesting for us when we get a new bird, particularly one that's been surrendered as an ex-captive, to try and figure out where it's been in a situation. And of course, all the noises as well. You can hear whether it's been with a child or, it's...
That's fascinating. I had no idea. Yeah. And so, are you still, there was a campaign at one time, I know, to get people to voluntarily hand in their birds. Is that still ongoing? Are we still seeing the challenge where people are still keeping the animals even though they shouldn't?
Yes, and although it's our goal to stop that completely, I doubt that we will ever completely stamp that out because it's a very strong desire for people to own a parrot. I think probably Ms. Shinelli can enlarge on this, but the Forest Department and Belize Bird Rescue are still working towards an end to the registration program and eventually to stop the introduction of any new birds into captivity. So I don't know if Ms. Shinelli wanted to expand on that at all.
Sure. Yeah. So from the numbers in the past, the numbers of just getting percentages, we have seen that the major issue or the most amount of work that we have is just with reports of illegal wildlife pets. And percentage-wise, 57% of the illegal wildlife pets that we get reported on are for parrots, and 23% are for primates. So we can see that with primates and parrots, it makes up a large percentage of the illegal pets that are being kept by Belizeans in their homes. So we recognize that, yes, this is an issue because it means that these species are being removed from the wild and their numbers can just continue decreasing if we let that continue to happen. So we have tried to make sure that, as Paul mentioned, we do not approve for monkeys to be kept as pets. So those are confiscated, or we ask that they be surrendered and they go into the rehabilitation process. And we do the same for parrots. So we work along with Belize Bird Rescue. When we have to confiscate or we get surrendered birds, they go into this rehabilitation process to hopefully return to the wild. But as Ms. Nikki said, some of these animals are sometimes have injuries or have other issues that it just sometimes makes it difficult for them to return to the wild. And that's what people have to realize, that we are actually damaging these animals up to a point where they're no longer healthy, even if we try rehabilitation processes. So illegal wildlife pets is a big issue in Belize, and the Forest Department is trying to make sure that we want to educate people about why it's important to keep these animals in the wild and not in our homes. And right now, especially, we're in a pandemic. And if we see how this began, it was a link to wildlife. Just how are we interacting with wildlife species? And so these wildlife species in the wild, they are natural reservoirs for a lot of bacteria, viruses, and diseases. And we want to prevent that from being transmitted to humans. We don't want other issues such as COVID-19 to be continue popping up in the future. So we have to make sure that people understand that these animals can be dangerous if we keep them at home.
Yeah. And I think, Paul, you noted that the animals need the forest and the forest needs the animals. I can imagine for your particular group that you're talking about, when we see these cute little monkeys on set, people may be drawn to them as wanting to keep them as pets. But what are some of the other threats that they face as well?
Deforestation remains the biggest threat to Belize's monkeys. And the pet trade was the second biggest. The Forest Department's been very successful in reducing the pet trade, although it's an ongoing process. We've had 2 monkeys confiscated or surrendered from the pet trade so far this year, which is still a big decrease from how it was 10 years ago. But back to the point of risks, one of the messages that people have taken on board is that disease risk is real and present. More than 90%, nearly 100% of the monkeys that come in from the pet trade test positive for Giardia, which is a very nasty infection present in the human population, causes severe GI tract problems, diarrhea. And when people are told that, if you've got a pet monkey, your entire family will have caught Giardia from that monkey, and unless you go and get treatment, you're going to have an upset gut in many years. So zoonotic diseases are an ongoing present issue already. We're not just looking at future potential risk, we're looking at current issues. So when monkeys are surrendered by families, one of the messages we get to those is go and see your doctor, get tested and get some treatment, because otherwise you're going to have GI tract problems for many years to come.
Interesting. Yeah. All right. And just, in wrapping up, I know one of the things that is critical is that we also know how we can support or be able to contact agencies like Wild Tracks, like Bird Rescue, and how the forestry can intervene if you do know of displaced animals.
Yes.
Exactly.
So we do ask the public every time we have the chance, please, if you know of illegal wildlife pets being kept at homes, please contact the Forest Department, contact Wild Tracks, the Belize Bird Rescue, or any of the other wildlife rehabilitation centers that we work with. So certain species, they are just so dangerous. Don't risk it by keeping them at homes. They can also be a danger to the neighbors. So if you have if you see this happening, let us think about these animals need to be in the wild. And if we have them as pets, give us a call, 822-1524, and we can see what we can do to help these animals to make sure that they are healthy and in the wild.
And Paul and Nikki, I think in closing, it's definitely sending that message out that if you are intentionally putting the forest at risk for fires or clearing spaces, what's the consideration we must all have of what we're doing in removing the habitats for these species?
I think the main thing is for it to be balanced. Clearly Belize needs development, but there's a lot of waste in terms of land usage. We need the land use plan to finally be completed and enacted, so that there is a balance between the conservation and protection of forest cover, which we need for rainfall, for climate change mitigation and all the rest of it, but also allows for agricultural expansion. The country needs agriculture, it needs to be able to feed itself. But it should be done in a planned manner using the most effective lands, best use for lands. We have the plans. It's really a matter of trying to ensure that that is enacted upon.
My pet hate is when area of land is completely cleared. I think the favorite example is the cattle ranching down as you go down toward the Southern Highway, and they have cleared thousands of acres and put cows on it, and there's probably 3 trees left, and whenever I drive past, those cows are huddled under those 3 trees. Now surely that tells you something. We need trees. You know, it's not a big deal to leave a few around. It's not a big deal to leave a buffer zone. Yes, you're going to lose out on some farming land, but what you get back from the pest control, the natural pest control from the natural species that live in those buffer zones, you will get back 100-fold. You'll get rat control, you'll get insect and tick control. It's a symbiosis, and we have to recognize that, and we have to work in accordance with that.
All right. And so we definitely want to thank everyone for coming in today and sharing all of their knowledge and concerns about Belize's future when it comes to wildlife and deforestation. So thank you all for coming in.
Thank you for having us.
And with that, we are going to be taking our final break, and when we come back, we are going to have our wrap-up, so please stay tuned.